Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Good morning. Anyway, is everybody there?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Because I see the screen "Faith on Troubled Waters" with the title in my name, but I don't see anything else. That's great. How is everybody today? Well, listen, it's real great to be with you this morning. Thank you for this opportunity to share in this worship time with you. Just to let you know, today is my 45th wedding. Ooh. All right, now here we go. Today, as I was saying, is my 45th wedding anniversary, June 28th. So my wife and I, sometime early afternoon, will be going out east to the eastern end of Long Island. So it's a special day for us. Just want to give thanks to God for 45 years. But let's look at the text here, Acts 27, verses 13 to 38. It's hard for us to imagine in these days when we used to travel relatively easy, it's hard for us to imagine the terror that the people of Paul's day and earlier uh, uh, looked at traveling on the open sea. The rabbis taught that there was three mouths that sucked in the dead. One was the city of Jerusalem. The second one was uh, the wilderness, and the third one was the depths of the oceans. So to venture out onto the sea for the ancient Hebrews, especially, was to come very close to the shadowy realms of the dead. That's how much they were afraid of it. And not only that, there was this belief that the waters of the oceans represented the chaos that many lives are in, and it's the uncontrollable fury of nature. And in the creation story, you read that the Spirit of God hovered over the chaos and calmed the waters. And so the ancient person, Paul, among them, uh, knew that it was only because of the hand of God that the waters of creation or the chaos would overcome the earth. And so whenever anybody would arise near a seashore, if they lived near the ocean or near the coast, they would always thank God that chaos had been averted overnight by God's hand keeping back the waters of the sea. So there's there's a lot of apprehension about traveling on the oceans. We don't have much about it in the Bible, as a matter of fact. We have, of course, Noah, and we have Jonah, and we have Jesus and the disciples and Paul here, but that's about it when it comes to the ocean. And in the last part of the Bible, to tell you how they looked at the sea, one of the things the new creation has or does not have is no sea. There's no ocean. That's what the writer John says. So uh, let's take a look at where we are in this book. We are in the midst of this extended travel log of Paul that began way back in chapter 22 when he comes back from collecting the offering for the saints in Jerusalem. He goes to the temple, and while he's there in worship, he is arrested and he is brought before the Sanhedrin in the city of Jerusalem in chapter 22 and 23. Because of that, he is sent to Caesarea, a little bit north, to stand trial, and he stands a series of three trials before Felix and Festus and Agrippa, and he appeals to Rome because he is a Roman citizen. So they decide to send him to Rome. So these chapter after chapter after chapter, we're following Paul's travel to Rome. This voyage takes place probably in AD 60 or maybe 61. And in case you're wondering, the accuracy of the account is really indisputable. A Scottish man named James Smith, he was a yachtsman and an engineer in the 19th century, wanted to disprove this trip. And he retraced the steps of the voyage of the Apostle Paul in these chapters. He visited all the ports of call. He sounded the depths of the ocean. He took sightings of the wind that all are mentioned in the book of Acts, and he came to the conclusion that in every nautical detail, this story is exactly accurate as it is recorded in this chapter. So here we have Paul, an apostle, in the autumn of his years, making his final voyage of witness, and he's accompanied by Luke, his physician. You notice how the text includes the words we, because Luke is actually here during this time. And Aristarchus, who was a convert from Thessalonica, accompanied Paul. We're not sure why they were allowed to do that, because Paul is one of many prisoners being escorted to Rome. Some have suggested that they went because they were portrayed as Paul's slaves, and that would increase Paul's respectability amongst the crew. Whatever it is, Paul is accompanied by Luke and Aristarchus. Other people on board have already been condemned to death. Julius is the Roman centurion. He's been trained as a part of the imperial guard. He is a special op force of the empire, but he's kind-hearted, and he is escorting this group of prisoners to appear before Caesar. We have the captain of the ship. We have the crew of the ship. People who are men of business, and they are all unaware of the greater purposes of God being accomplished on board while they travel from Asia Minor to Rome. Now, beyond the accuracy and the adventure of the story itself, I'd like to try to apply this story as we look at it section by section. This voyage sounds a lot like our world right now. Adrift, in danger, without many options, not many solutions. One word I've become acquainted with during this pandemic is the word VUCA, V-U-C-A. It's a whole series of business training based on this. It's an acronym. V stands for volatile, and volatile means rapid or unpredictable change. The U is for uncertainty. The C is for complexity. And the A is for ambiguous. So you have volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And if that doesn't sound like the world we're in, I don't know what else would. So we're on troubled waters too. Troubled, dangerous waters. And with all of that going on around us, how does one person of faith act on troubled waters? That's the title of the message, Faith on Troubled Waters. Well, there's one certainty that we all share, and that is this: we will all face days of troubled waters. We are going to know what it's like to be on a boisterous and buffeting sea, trying to survive in a fragile craft. What does the person of faith do in a situation like that? That's what I want to challenge you with today. Well, the trip began in relative calm. It allowed for stops along the way for refreshment, but as soon as the wind turned against this little ship, they are unable to go any further. And by the providence and grace of God, they meet a larger ship, a grain ship, going from Egypt to Italy, and they join that ship on their way to Rome. However, the winds are blowing them further and further off course, and they finally make it to a place called Fair Haven. They're delayed many days. They don't know what to do. It's getting late in the year. Travel is dangerous as it gets towards September and October, and they call a council, and they invite Paul to be a part of that council. They're going to decide what their next steps will be. And Paul tells them, I don't think you should do this. You should winter here. If you set sail, there's going to be great loss. You see that in verse 10. Well, he is overruled, and they set sail from Fair Havens, and they disregard Paul's warning. And then disaster comes. In the text itself, it says, if I could point that verse out to you, it's in verse 13 and 14, a storm arose. The word that Luke uses here is the word from which we get typhoon. It was a typhonic wind, as he says in the original language, what we all call a northeaster. And it blows them off course. They're no longer near land. They're in the open sea. And they do a series of things to try to survive. They bring the lifeboat on board. They string ropes from one side of the ship to the other. They somehow pass ropes underneath the hull of the ship up the other side, and they tighten those ropes to keep the boat from breaking apart. If you ever heard the phrase shiver me timbers, it comes from something like this. When a storm would rock these wooden boats so much, it would actually shake the timbers of the boats loose. So they are trying to prevent that. They wrap the boat in ropes, and they secure them to keep the boat from breaking apart. And over the next couple of days, they throw the cargo overboard. They throw some of their gear overboard. And if that was not enough, they couldn't even see the sun or the stars. So they're without navigational help. It's dark. And at the last, finally, the 276 passengers on board, it says, give up all hope of being saved. That's the word that's used there in the original language. It's the word that we use a lot, to be saved. In the midst of this darkness and despair and hopelessness is one person of faith. In those days of dreariness, lost, without options, hopelessly adrift, amongst a motley crew of soldiers and the captains and merchants and military people, Paul stands up. The first thing he says to them in the midst of this storm in verse 21 is essentially this: I told you so. You should have listened to what I had to say. But that's not all that he says. If you could pull up verses 23 and 24 for me, please. There we go. Yeah. Paul knew something that the other people on board did not know. Paul had heard something that the other people on board had not heard. He had a special visitation from a heavenly messenger. That's what the word angel means. And he was assured of his future. He says to Paul, don't be afraid. So he's a man now. He has a divine purpose. It's in his heart. And because he knew what God had in store for him, he knew the truth about God. Every other person associated with Paul is going to have their lives spared. Just hold that thought for a second. So this is not the first time that Paul has been assured of this. If you've been following the story in the book of Acts, you know that back in Ephesus, in the days of missionary expansion, when he was opposed in that city, when an entire town arose kind of like a storm in opposition to Paul, an angel appeared to him, and he was convinced, I must go to Rome. Then when he was arrested in Jerusalem and thrown into the fortress of Antonia, the same fortress that Jesus spent time in the middle of the night, it says the Lord Jesus appeared to him and said to this bruised and beaten apostle, you must testify before me in Rome. That's chapter 23, verse 11. And then again, in one of his trials, Festus said, you must go to Rome and stand before Caesar. So now on these troubled waters, what had been his purpose in Ephesus, what the risen Christ had promised him in Jerusalem, what a pagan judge had unwittingly expedited in Caesarea, becomes the purpose of his life and gives him his assurance and his destiny. But in spite of Paul's encouraging words, the storm continues to beat on them. Without any navigational help, no resources, the crew loses hope of survival. And even though Paul had sought to encourage them by the words of this angelic messenger that they would all survive, the evidence seemed to go in the other direction. You can just imagine the crew talking with each other. Hey, I just don't see this. We've been on this. In this storm for 14 days already. I haven't seen an angel. Did you see an angel? I certainly haven't. Nobody else here has. His advice to us is about as silly as it can be. So they decide to do what their natural training has taught them. Though they can't see, their ears are listening to the sounds of the surf crashing on the shore. And they begin to take soundings. They begin to drop weights into the water to see how deep the sea is. And it's 120 feet, then it's 90 feet, and they know they're getting closer and closer to land. They can hear the waves crashing on the rocks, and they know it's just a matter of time before this ship is busted by all these waves beating on them as it takes the ship closer to the shore. So they get together and they tie 4 anchors together and drop it off the back of the boat to kind of create a drag to slow the surfs dragging the ship towards this inevitable conclusion. They drop 4 anchors and then they all turn to pray, it says. However, there was other plans unfolding. Under the pretext of dropping additional anchors off the front of the boat, the sailors, including the owner, the captain, and the crew, attempt to let down the lifeboat to get away under cover of darkness. The only one with courage on that deck, the only one with insight into the truth of their situation is this person of faith named Paul. And Paul knows a mutiny is about to happen. He calls on his escort, Julius the centurion, and the soldiers rise up and cut the ropes, and the lifeboats are lost. So here we have a ship full of fearful, panicked, divided passengers. They've been buffeted by the storm for weeks. And now in complete darkness, their boat is nearing this rocky shoreline, and their emotions are raw. Their nerves are frayed. The wind continues to moan. The waves continue to crash. The ship is getting closer and closer to shipwreck. And in their eyes, it's all but certain. Paul, however, this one man, lives out his faith right in front of them. He brings the entire crew together. And in verses 36, he actually encourages them to eat in what almost sounds like the Lord's Supper. He takes bread, he prays, he breaks bread, and he gives it to the rest of the crew. And all 276 passengers are encouraged. Now, I've called this message Faith on Troubled Waters. Let me give some applications to this. First, if there's ever a time when not only we, but the people around us need a word like this, it's today. The person of faith on troubled waters can be calm and confident. Paul endured this storm because he was willing to bring a voice of truth to that situation. He was willing to stand in opposition to the prevailing wisdom of everybody else on board. He was in tension with a generation and the dominant mood of that day. He was willing to stand in counterpoint to the doomsayers around him because he knew the God who was in control. Faith on troubled waters knows who is ultimately in control. And the person of faith can genuinely encourage others in days of despair because he knows the one who is ultimately in charge. Second, you can be a person of faith on troubled waters because you know God's purposes for your life, because you know God's truth for your life. You see, when you know your destiny, when you know God's purpose for your life, when you know God's will for your life, you can be calm and confident. You can be a person of faith. Do you notice how Paul says this? He says, in relating to this angelic messenger, he says, an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve. The God whose I am and whom I serve. There's a security in that. There's a confidence in that. There's an inner witness of your heart to the purpose of God for your life. And when you're assured of that, when you know who's in control and you know what his will is for you, other people then can be swept up into that purpose as well. Luke and Aristarchus and Julius, the imperial Roman guards, the captain, the crew, the prisoners, all 276 of them, they are all saved because their lives are tied to this man of faith and purpose. Think about that. Third thing I would say is the person of faith on troubled waters in the middle of God's purposes can bring a preservative impact on those around them. You can impact and influence those around you. You can save others around you. Abraham, when he heard the call of God, walked off the map, following God and his purposes. Moses marched off into the wilderness, and the Red Sea split open, and several million were delivered. When you say something like Joshua said, as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord, you're going to impact other families that are trying to find their way through troubled waters. There's something about being in the center of the purposes of God and the will of God on this earth that gives faith impact in days of despair. And then the fourth thing I would say is that faith on troubled waters gives you an opportunity to live out your faith in the sight of other people. Look at what Paul does. He knew about faith during the sunny days. He's now going to live out his faith at midnight. He knew what it was like to live in days of calm. He's about to show them what faith looks on the rough seas. And so in verse 34, he demonstrates this by giving out bread and thanking God in front of all of them. And you almost get the sense that Paul is like a priest for the entire crew. He is representing them before God. He's praying for them. He's speaking to them. He's testifying to them in the middle of their terror and their fear and their uncertainty. And look at what verse 24 says. This is interesting. The message of the angel to Paul was this: God has graciously given you the lives of all those who sail with you. That's verse 24. This is almost like an answer to prayer language, right? In other words, Paul, don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Jesus, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. There it is. Thank you, Nelson. There is a sense in which Paul has already prayed for them. He's already brought them before God. He's identified with their uncertainty and with their fear. He has brought the crew, the passengers, fellow prisoners, and those who are traveling with him before God. There's a sense in which he has assumed responsibility for this boat, even though he's not the captain and he's not the owner. He's like a priest before God for them. He's identifying with them. He's doing exactly what Jesus did when Isaiah said about Jesus, he was numbered with the transgressors and he made intercession for them. So I have noticed in this uncertain time that we evangelicals, we like to talk about being preachers or messengers to people. And we sometimes measure our effectiveness or our impact by how well we communicate to people. The preaching, the communicating, the teaching aspect of being the witnessing aspect of being a believer. But there's another component to our calling, and that's this priestly function, this sense in which we represent others before God. We help others come into the presence of God in the midst of troubled waters. And that's what Paul's doing. So what happens when a person of faith is in trouble, going through a tough time, life is threatened? Paul's example to us, his confidence, his assurance in the purposes of God are on full display, and he brings everybody with him. So at the end of the story in verse 36, all of those who are with him are eventually delivered. So, man, in the midst of this pandemic we are in, and this volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous time, we can say the same thing that Paul said. He said, I believe in God. I belong to God, right? And I serve him. And this is what his purpose is for me. This is what his purpose is for you. And even though we may be on a deck that's, uncertain, and we've lost all footing in the midst of a murderous kind of storm, we say to other people around us, I believe God and I serve him. I belong to him. And you know what? Perhaps God will, like he did with Paul, give you other souls to keep as well. I can't help but believe that years later, someone like Julius the centurion, at least a dozen or so of those 276 other crew and passengers would say, you know what? I'm alive today because of that man of faith on troubled waters. I owe everything to that person because of what he did and what he said and how he prayed for me during that time out on the open sea. My life was spared because of him. I was on a shipwrecked course, a course that was going to lead me to destruction, and my life was going to crash on the rocks and disintegrate into a million pieces. Certain death was ahead of me, but my life was preserved because that believer pointed me to the purposes of God. I listened to what he said or she said. I watched what he did or she did. I saw his character or her character. I saw them take hold of the truth of God and the word of God and the promise of God and the power of God. And now today, my life is spared because of that person of faith on troubled waters. That's my prayer for us. That's my message to you today. You can be calm and confident because you know the God who is in control. You know God's purposes for your life. You can be a priest before God, representing other people during this time of fear and uncertainty. And then you can live out your life with confidence, and you'll bring others into a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ because of who you are, whose you are, and who you serve. Lord Jesus, thank you for this time. Thank you for this story. Thank you for the details that Luke includes. And thank you for the truth of this text, of the impact of one person who got on this ship as a prisoner and ended up being in control the entire voyage. Help us to be that person for you. In Jesus' name, amen.